It has now been almost 176 years since the United States concluded its war and subsequent invasion of Mexican territory. The Mexican government ultimately surrendered after 2 years of intense conflict, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty not only ended the brutal war but also resulted in Mexico ceding over half of its territory to its northern neighbor. Through this 1848 agreement, regions that are now known as Utah, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, and parts of Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Kansas transitioned from Mexican to American control. The Mexican-American War left a profound impact on the histories of both nations. While Mexico suffered substantial casualties and territorial losses, Native American tribes in the Southwest were also significantly affected by the shifting borders and new geopolitical landscape. In today's episode of Native Journal, we'll explore how the Mexican-American War impacted Native communities in the Southwest. As we delve into this topic, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for joining us. First, let's briefly discuss the Mexican-American War, a conflict that remains largely unnoticed in the U.S. today, despite its pivotal role in shaping the country's southern boundary alongside the Gadsden Purchase of 1854. Signed in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo effectively ended the war and ceded over half of Mexico's national territory to the United States. This agreement expanded the U.S. by adding present-day California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, along with portions of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, in the city of Guadalupe Hidalgo, north of Mexico City, marked the end of hostilities. Mexico was compelled to cede 55% of its territory, including modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, and much of Arizona and Colorado. It also relinquished all claims to Texas, recognizing the Rio Grande as the U.S. Mexico border. In September 1847, following Mexico's military defeat in the fall of its capital, negotiations commenced. Nicholas Trist, chief clerk of the State Department, accompanied General Winfield Scott as a negotiator and President Polk's representative. Trist's determination to secure a treaty, even against President Polk's orders to withdraw, ultimately led to an agreement with the Mexican commissioners, Bernardo Couto, Miguel Atristán, and Luis Gonzaga Cuevas. In a December 4, 1847 letter, Trist stated that he believed this was the last opportunity to secure a peace deal. Disregarding the president's recall order, Trist, guided by his own principles, negotiated a settlement that would cost him his career. He became a controversial figure in the U.S. for his actions, yet his treaty paved the way for the Mexican cession, transferring Upper California and New Mexico to the United States. This cession also included parts of modern Utah, Nevada, and Colorado, alongside Arizona and New Mexico. The treaty also required Mexico to surrender claims to Texas and recognize the Rio Grande as the border. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed debts owed by the Mexican government to American citizens. Additionally, the treaty included provisions to protect the property and civil rights of Mexican nationals within the new borders, obligated the U.S. to police these boundaries and mandated arbitration of future disputes between the two countries. Trist's agreement eventually reached Washington, leaving President Polk to decide whether to support or reject his subordinates' actions. Polk submitted the treaty to the Senate, where it was ratified by a 34-14 vote, ultimately cementing the terms and ensuring the protection of Mexican land grants under U.S. law. After U.S. troops withdrew from Mexico City, the U.S. government appointed Commissioner Colonel John Weller, Surveyor Andrew Gray, along with General Pedro Conde and Sr. José Alarregui, who represented Mexico, to implement the treaty and establish the border. The Gadsden Purchase, signed on December 30, 1853, adjusted the original boundary line by adding 47 new markers to the initial 6. Of the 53 boundary markers, most were simple stone piles, while a few were made of solid materials bearing proper inscriptions. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to determine the exact location of the markers, with both countries claiming that the originals had been moved or destroyed. In the 1880s, the two nations agreed on a protocol to resolve this issue, and a subsequent survey confirmed that the boundary needed redefinition. As a result, the International Boundary Commission was formed to reposition the landmarks and clearly mark the boundary line. To document this process, the U.S. commissioners hired a survey photographer to capture various perspectives of each monument erected by the United States section. Although the Mexican-American War officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848, the end of the military conflict marked the beginning of a new struggle, one whose effects continued to shape the United States to this day. Ulysses S. Grant famously argued that the Mexican-American War was an immoral conflict driven by imperialism and the expansion of slavery, suggesting that the Civil War was divine retribution for it. Nonetheless, many Americans supported the Mexican-American War, viewing it as the fulfillment of manifest destiny, a belief that the United States was destined to expand from coast to coast. The idea of manifest destiny was at the core of U.S. national identity during the 1840s. However, it also fueled intense philosophical debates about the fate of the newly acquired territory, specifically whether these areas should be free or allow slavery. The Louisiana Purchase had previously sparked a major crisis concerning the organization of new states, a conflict that Congress ultimately addressed with the Missouri Compromise, one of the most significant divisions in U.S. history. It is important to note that the debates in 1820 were largely divided along party lines, such as Democrats versus Whigs. The Mexican-American War reopened these old wounds, plunging the United States into yet another legislative crisis. Even before the war ended and the territory was ceded, Congress was already debating how to organize any potential new land acquired from Mexico. One of the most significant proposals during the debate over newly acquired territories was the Wilmot Proviso. Introduced by Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania in 1846, 2 years before the Mexican-American War ended. Under this stipulation, any territory acquired from Mexico should be free, thereby reserved exclusively for whites. Wilmot was a free soiler, meaning he did not seek to abolish slavery where it already existed but aimed to prevent its spread to new territories. At the same time, Wilmot was a Northern Democrat, and many Democrats, even those who did not own slaves, were in favor of and defended slavery. The slave power conspiracy was a theory held by many Northern Whigs, suggesting that despite being a minority, slave owners dominated the country's political system through alliances with doughface Democrats, Northern Democrats who supported and protected slavery. While the Wilmot Proviso ultimately failed in the Senate, it passed in the House of Representatives, thanks to an alliance between Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs. This marked a key shift from party coalitions to sectional alliances. The Wilmot Proviso united Southerners against what they perceived as Northern threats to slavery, the institution at the core of their economy and society. The vote on the proviso permanently altered the political landscape of the antebellum era. Its failure only postponed the inevitable debate on slavery. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded over 525,000 square miles of territory to the United States in exchange for $15 million and the assumption of Mexican debts to American citizens. This vast new land acquisition revived the contentious issue of slavery. In an attempt to maintain party loyalty without exacerbating sectional tensions, the Whigs did not include any explicit positions on slavery in their official platform for the 1848 election. The Democrats, on the other hand, ran on the idea of popular sovereignty, which held that the status of slavery in a territory would be determined by the people residing there. Popular sovereignty was neither explicitly pro-slavery nor abolitionist, but it effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise. Neither of the major parties took a firm stance on slavery during the 1848 election, leaving the Free Soilers to make the election about the expansion of slavery. In response, the Whigs and Democrats created campaign materials that varied by region, highlighting their candidates' support for or opposition to slavery depending on the audience. These divergent campaign materials revealed the deepening sectional divide in pre-Civil War America. Zachary Taylor, a slave-owning Whig and hero of the Mexican-American War, won the presidency in 1848, despite the growing sectionalism. Taylor's popularity, stemming from his military success, played a major role in his election. After taking office, Taylor pledged not to interfere with Congress's decisions on organizing the newly acquired territories from Mexico. Many Southerners felt betrayed by Taylor, a Louisiana slave owner, as they perceived his stance to be aligned with that of a free soiler. In this period of heightened sectional tensions, Southerners believed that if one did not actively defend slavery and its expansion, one was effectively supporting abolition. The California Gold Rush began in 1849 as a direct consequence of the Mexican Cession, sparking a frenzy to organize California and bring it into the Union. The Missouri Compromise had stipulated that any territory north of the 36 degrees 30 feet parallel would be free, however. This line would have split California in two. California, unlike other territories, never went through a formal territorial phase. It adopted a free constitution, elected a governor and legislature, and applied for statehood by November 1849. As California sought to enter the Union as a single free state, a new compromise emerged, the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California to join as a free state without deciding the fate of the rest of the Mexican Cession. Additionally, the compromise included the federal assumption of Texas's debt, the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and the establishment of a stricter fugitive slave law. Although controversial, the Compromise of 1850 temporarily alleviated growing tensions over slavery and delayed a full-blown crisis. However, tensions flared again in 1854 over the organization of Kansas and Nebraska. Although these territories were not part of the Mexican Cession, their fate was directly tied to the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reintroduced popular sovereignty as a means of determining the status of slavery in these territories. This led to a period known as Bleeding Kansas, where both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, hoping to sway the decision. Violence erupted, with neighbors killing each other over the issue of slavery. Bleeding Kansas was also the first instance in which John Brown, later known for his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, used violence to pursue his radical abolitionist agenda. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the brainchild of Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who strongly supported popular sovereignty. In 1858, Douglas and Abraham Lincoln engaged in a series of debates over popular sovereignty and the spread of slavery. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race to Douglas, these debates propelled him into the national spotlight and positioned him as the Republican candidate for the 1860 presidential election. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also spelled the end for the Whig Party, paving the way for the rise of the Republican Party, which would become the most prominent anti-slavery political force. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously warned that, "Mexico will poison us." The debates over slavery reignited by the Mexican-American War weakened party alliances and strengthened sectional loyalties, leading to the collapse of the second party system and the rise of sectionalism. By the 1850s, talk of secession became increasingly open and tensions rose, eventually culminating in the election of 1860 and, ultimately, the Civil War, a conflict in which brothers fought against brothers. To say that Mexico poisoned the United States is an understatement. The Civil War's bloodshed rivaled that of any other American conflict, and its wounds are still healing to this day. The war and its resulting treaty helped the United States become a continental power, extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Today, the politics surrounding the southern border are still influenced by this history, though the conflict and its outcome are central to the histories of both the U.S. In Mexico, they are remembered very differently. In Mexican schools, children learn of the conflict as La Intervención Estadounidense, the U.S. intervention, and it remains a source of national resentment. Conversely, the war is hardly remembered by the general public in the United States, overshadowed by narratives like the California Gold Rush and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Events often presented as natural and inevitable rather than the outcomes of an aggressive war. Despite the differences in how the two nations remember the treaty, both national narratives are framed in patriotic terms, whether as victims of an unjust war or as inheritors of manifest destiny. As the U.S. continues to debate how to teach its history, it is crucial to move beyond these nationalistic accounts and consider the war and its treaty from the perspective of the original inhabitants of this territory. When viewed from a native perspective, striking parallels emerge between the two warring nations. Both sought to seize native lands, held racist views of native peoples, and used law and violence to achieve their goals. In 1848, both the U.S. and Mexico were relatively young nations, having achieved independence in 1776 and 1821, respectively. Despite their rhetoric of independence, neither country fully broke from the colonial ideologies they inherited. Both nations embraced racial hierarchies, pursued territorial expansion, and upheld systems of property slavery. Both governments struggled, in the face of resilient native nations, to assert control over the lands and people of what is now the southwestern United States. **1658**. The land acquired by the U.S. through the treaty had once been part of colonial New Spain and later Mexico after 1821. Both the Spanish and Mexican governments had difficulty maintaining control over their northernmost territories. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is just one example of the significant native resistance to colonial rule. Upon gaining independence, the new Mexican government espoused liberal ideals of freedom and equality, yet often betrayed these principles, encroaching on native lands in the name of private property. While officials paid homage to the ancient Aztec civilization, they promoted policies of assimilation and the teaching of Spanish, to the detriment of native cultures. Despite formal authority over the land, powerful native tribes such as the Kiowa, Pueblo, Apache, Comanche, and Yaqui continued to maintain autonomy. Benefiting from their distance from Mexico City and the legacy of the Spanish República de Indios, a colonial policy that allowed for some forms of self-governance. Though Mexico formally abolished slavery in 1829, the practice persisted in the northern fringes, ensnaring both people of African descent and native groups. Native peoples faced colonial encroachments not only from the south but also from the east, as Comanche and other tribes saw their lands invaded by settlers during the Texas independence movement in the mid-1830s. This settler-driven project sought to maintain slavery and expand American influence. By the mid-1840s, native nations faced threats from virtually every direction. As tensions with Mexico escalated, some native groups chose to launch raids on Mexican settlements rather than negotiate with authorities. Historian Brian DeLay described these raids across northern Mexico as a war of 1,000 deserts, wherein native forces laid waste to settlements, leaving deserted and ruined towns in their wake. This prolonged native resistance weakened the Mexican government in 1846, just as the United States declared war. Even after the war began, U.S. forces faced considerable challenges. Despite pushing deep into Mexican territory, bombarding civilian areas in Veracruz, and occupying Mexico City, native resistance continued on both sides of the newly drawn U.S. Mexico border. Article 11 of the treaty, which required the U.S. government to protect Mexican territory from native raids, is a testament to the persistence of native power. In what is today Arizona and New Mexico, the treaty diminished the autonomy of numerous native nations. Maurice Crandall, a Yavapai Apache historian, noted that in 1848, the United States had never considered Indians as citizens. Native Americans fought for U.S. citizenship or other forms of legally protected status to preserve local control under this new colonial administration. There were divided opinions on citizenship. Some saw it as a means of community empowerment, while others viewed it as yet another form of subjugation. In California, the Constitutional Convention quickly moved to deny Native people the right to vote. During the Gold Rush, Native communities faced state-sanctioned violence that approached the level of genocide. Though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised protections for former Mexican residents in the U.S., Native communities and others struggled for years to have their property rights and cultural identities recognized. California implemented foreign minor taxes targeting Spanish-speaking residents, and native people were increasingly stripped of land, citizenship, and education. Though different, both the U.S. and Mexico employed racist, colonial tactics that oppressed indigenous peoples. Native communities found themselves resisting two competing colonial agendas, both seeking, at best, their forced assimilation and, at worst, their complete eradication. For generations, and regardless of which side of the U.S. Mexico border they found themselves on, native peoples fiercely defended their communities and lands, and that resistance continues to this day. As we reflect on the legacy of the 1848 treaty and the borders it created, it's important to consider the perspective from which we tell this history and its significance. Moving beyond nationalistic narratives to focus on the experiences of native peoples reveals a very different story. How we remember this history matters just as much as what we remember. Patriotic narratives make it difficult to imagine a world without borders and the inequality they perpetuate. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting and informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. We'll see you in our next video.